Okay, so we'll begin. A few disclaimers and notes of introduction to remind you that this is not a private conversation and ultimately will be made available to the public. We want it to be an enjoyable experience, so if at any time we enter a line of questioning that you're uncomfortable with or you don't want to answer, feel free to. If you need to take a break, just let me know that. My role in the conversation is to actually speak as little as possible, and I might be looking down at my notes here and there, but I'm always engaged in listening. So the formal beginning today is Friday, April 15th, 2016. My name is Andy Reisinger, and I'm interviewing Ted Brodek here in the Department of Special Collections and Archives at Georgia State University as part of the Great Speckled Bird Oral History Project. And before beginning, can I please get your verbal confirmation that you're aware that this is being recorded and you consent?
Yes, I consent.
So if we can start at the very beginning,
All right.
tell me a little bit about you, where you were born, biographical information.
All right. If I'm not mistaken, thinking back on it, I was probably the only immigrant in the bird grouping initially. I came to this country when I was 8 years old from Palestine. My parents had been German Jewish refugees who went there in 1933. My father, for a while, worked in one of the underground movements, smuggled guns and stuff like that. And when we came here in 1950, we landed in New York, and I grew up in New York. So not only was I an immigrant, but I was from the North when I finally came down here, which of course made a huge difference. And I only came here because I thought I'd stay a couple of years, had a job at Emory, and figured that that would be all I could want to do, and then I'd go somewhere else. I had no idea where. But I got so involved and married and so forth that I just stuck around. Became a pretty complete life. I realized I was not cut out for the academic world as I began to engage in other things, and just started to think about other ways to go, basically. And that's when I was involved with the bird during those initial years, because I came here in August, I think it was, of 1967. Started teaching in September and taught 4 years. And the bird was launched in March of '68. But prior to the bird being launched on Emory campus, one of the main, probably the main spark for the bird was a guy called Tom Coffin. I don't know if you've met him.
We have interviewed him.
Anyway, he was at Emory. He was a graduate student, and I met him during registration, him and his wife, Stephanie. And fairly shortly thereafter, he started an underground, quote-unquote, paper for Emory campus. There was, of course, an official Emory newspaper, but he did an American, off-the-record newspaper. I think it was called Big American Review. And then when a few months later he decided that he really didn't want to continue doing it at Emory, he went to start the bird. I sort of took over as the main person keeping it going for a while, for another few months. And we put out, several editions while the bird was beginning to form up. And then once the bird formed up, I still kept doing that, but at the same time I started inputting into the bird and realizing, this was an opportunity to engage in broader audiences and bigger issues to some degree. So that's kind of my background. I went to school in New York.
Yeah, can we go back and get the official date of your birth and location in Palestine?
Yeah, my official date of birth was May 21st, 1942. So I was born during a war, and I grew up in Palestine in another war because it was the Arab-Israeli War of 1948, and I was shot at. So, I have a somewhat different background of experience than a lot of the other bird people. And I was born in Tel Aviv. So I was born in the main Jewish city. But as you know, in 1942, there was no Israel.
Mm-hmm.
However, whenever I applied for a U.S. passport, they refused to put in Palestine.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, so those are the official dates. That's where I was, and that's where I left with my family in 1950.
And what is your family's background? You said that they were immigrants, or
German Jews.
refugees to
Yeah.
Palestine.
Mm-hmm.
What is their background, your parents' background prior to that?
Well, my mother worked for a while as a theatrical costumer. She had been trained in that, and so she did that. Was very interested in the film industry or entertainment generally. She was something of a singer. My father had been heavily involved in the German Revolution of 1918. I mean, seriously, even though he was only like 15 years old, he helped start some of the major organizations like the Reichsbanner Schwarz-Weiß-Rot or Schwarz-Rot-Gold, I don't remember exactly. Anyway, the main left, center-left student movement during the Weimar Republic, and he was just heavily involved in that, even before he graduated their equivalent to high school,
Mm-hmm.
which is actually more than high school.
Mm-hmm.
And in the early 20s, he was engaged in various peace movement events. I still have a picture of his where he is standing just two people to the right of Albert Einstein in 1923 at a peace event that occurred with some other major figures whom I don't know who they
Mm-hmm.
are, but they're all big shots. Anyway. And my grandfather had a publishing company doing commercial publications, sort of for traveling salesmen. My father worked with him, but he also then went into the banking business and worked for banks and became pretty much of a middle-class, committed banker. And then, of course, as the Nazis took power, he, having confronted them in many, many ways, in school and on the streets, realized this was no place to stay. And so my parents left in 1933, in March of 1933, only about 3 months after Hitler took power.
Where were they located in Germany?
In Berlin.
Mm.
My mother was actually born in a small town in Brandenburg, which encompasses Berlin,
Mm-hmm.
in a town called Görlitz, which is right now on the German-Polish border. Cute old town. But my father was a Berliner from birth, and my mother's family moved back there when her parents divorced when she was like 2 or 3 years old.
Mm-hmm.
So they moved back to Berlin, and so they both were Berliners, really. And that's where they met. And when they went to Palestine, they were not married, which was a bit unusual to do that and travel. But they had come through a much more liberalized environment, and it wasn't so shocking. And no one really opposed it. So, and my father brought his parents with him, because my grandfather says, well, if you're going, I'm going. There's no reason for me to stick around here. And so he and his wife followed my father. My mother's mother didn't. She had 2 younger children, didn't want to leave them or felt it would be difficult to take them. But a few years later, she did take them. They were by then 12 years old, twins. So my mother's half-sisters. And they were going to stay. There was no question they were going to stay in Palestine because then things were getting, it was just before Kristallnacht,
Mm-hmm.
but it was getting close. And so they were getting serious vibes of major events. But for reasons I've never been able to figure out or clarify, even before my parents died and talked to them about it, she decided to go back to Germany. And so the grandmother went back, and then eventually she was aghast in Auschwitz in 1944. I have seen letters of hers that she sent to my mother that passed German censorship. This was before she was in Auschwitz, while she was in either Theresienstadt, which was before Auschwitz for her, or just in Germany whenever she had to send mail that had to go through censorship. They tear you up because they say nothing, and that's exactly the point. And then you have these cutouts, and you read one and you say, oh my God. Especially when you know what transpired later.
Yeah.
It's horrible. So, my mother and her sisters survived because they left. And then later on, one of her sisters eventually went back to Germany and lived in the heartland of Wolfsburg, the VW Center. She became a labor leader of workers. And the other one came here, as well as my mother, and lived in Connecticut, where she died some 10, 12 years ago. My uncle is still alive. He's an Auschwitz survivor. He's 95. He's still sharp as a tack and lives by himself and takes care of everything, drives like a demon, does what he wants. Very, very fine person. I grew up in New York, got there in 1950, went to public school, graduated high school, went to Columbia College afterwards, because New York State had a good scholarship program, so we could afford it. And my sister decided not to go to college, but she went to a business school. And after I graduated college, I went to California, to Berkeley. This was the year before the '64 uprising. I was there the year before that. So it was before this free speech movement. But there was already quite a bit of sense of things changing. I still remember the day that Kennedy was assassinated. I was walking through campus, and everybody else thought it was so significant. To me, it was, one president goes, another one comes in. I never had any strong feelings for him because he almost put the whole world into atomic warfare. And there I went to sleep in New York and the Cuban Missile Crisis and saying, might not wake up tomorrow morning. That was kind of an exaggerated thought, but still. And I said, any man who could conceive of carrying out a nuclear war shouldn't be in the position he's in. So, on Berkeley campus, although there was massive support for him, it was all this just very liberal campus, but not necessarily very analytic.
Yeah.
What else could I say? Okay, once I got here to the U.S. and went to school in New York, I found myself at odds with the Jewish community pretty quickly. For a while, I thought I was a Republican. You don't have many categories to put yourself in when you're very young. And the reason for that was that Eisenhower opposed the invasion of the Sinai by the British, French, or Egypt, to regain the Suez Canal, and Israel took the Sinai. And he said, no, get out. And the American Jewish community freaked. And I was in a class in a public school which was 95% Jewish. And I was the only one that was born in Palestine, or what they called Israel. And I wasn't opposed to Israel at that point, but I was opposed to what they did, and I supported Eisenhower, which my father supported too. He said, this is wrong. And so I was blackballed by the majority of the Jewish student population. So I learned then that I could go my own way. The next major incident between myself and the Jewish community was actually when I was working with the Bird and writing articles. And one day I went to Georgia State, in point of fact, where they had invited a speaker from a Israeli Zionist organization called Matzben. And he spoke in whatever auditorium it was. And I just went to cover the event the way I would have done other things when I had time to do it, and wrote an article. What had occurred was that Georgia State Zionists, Jewish Zionists, had come in to the auditorium and kept disrupting his speaking. I got royally pissed off. I wanted to hear him. And here these guys were telling me I couldn't hear him. I got a little angry. Didn't get into any fight. I'm not a very physically combative person. But I thought it was very unfair. You invite someone to speak and then you disrupt everything he says. It's another thing to raise questions. Now, of course, there are other times now that I feel that those tactics are quite legitimate. But at that time, I rejected them. And I wrote about it, and we got flack right and left for considering this guy and writing an article that was sort of friendly towards him and looked into what he was saying and so on and so forth. And then I realized the whole issue had to be reconsidered. You know, is Israel simply going to be seen as a major power there rather than a home for Jews, but also providing a place for the Palestinian community to have a home? And so I got engaged in that for many years with the American Friends, which was the only organization that really tried to take an even-handed position. You know, those are the Quakers, to balance out the two communities. And Atlanta was one of the main areas where they had a staff person working on it for about 15, 20 years. I wasn't a staff person, I was just a committee member, volunteer, sort of thing. So, well, that's taken us off track quite a bit here. So,
Yeah, but provided a nice baseline. So you mentioned that you have a sister. Is she your only sibling?
Yep. She's my only sibling, right? She's 2 years younger.
And where in New York City did you reside and grow up?
Forest Hills, which was not a totally, but a heavily Jewish area. There were parts of it that were not. But the school was overwhelmingly Jewish. I mean, like, the high school I went to had 4,500 students, and all but maybe 300 were Jewish. And I know this because when I went into school on Jewish holidays, because I said, if I don't believe in the Jewish faith and I'm not a practicing Jew, there's no legitimacy to stay out on Jewish holidays. It was me and 300 Christians.
Was the rest of your family practicing?
No. My father really was he was a Zionist at a time on a nationalist basis, but not on a religious basis. And religion didn't matter to him. He did get bar mitzvahed, but he never practiced in any way. I didn't even get bar mitzvahed. He said, "Do you want to do it?" And I said, "No." So that ended that. So as far as the Jewish community is concerned, I'm not an adult because I never went through the bar mitzvah cycle, which is fine by me. So religion did not play any kind of role, really, in my family.
And then, so you went through your schooling and graduated and went to Columbia College. What did you study there?
Well, I studied history, mainly European history. And Columbia at that time, of course, had a broad requirement of various courses. Had to study botany, for example. And my minor was primarily German literature, not even German history so much as just German literature. So I did a lot of reading of German classics and modern German literature up through the Weimar period. And sociology. That was the other thing I really got entranced by. Classic sociologists and social structures, but not the kind of poll-taking stuff, just more analytic sociology and trying to figure out, how communities function, how they integrate and fail to integrate, how they make decisions and so forth. So that's basically what I studied.
And then did you go immediately from Columbia to Berkeley? And was that to continue studying history and literature, or?
Well, I was basically a history major then. And the year I spent at Berkeley, I got a master's. I just studied European history, Renaissance history, German history. The reason I went there was because one of the leading scholars of early modern German history, which I was getting more interested in rather than very modern German history, was there. So I went there for a year, and they didn't offer me any money to stay, but Columbia did to come back. So I came back to Columbia, which is where eventually I got my PhD.
Mm-hmm.
But that's many years down the road.
So there was a big gap between completing your master's and then going back to Columbia. When did you go back?
Let's see. I went to Berkeley from 63, 64, back to Columbia 64, stayed there till 66, and then I went 2 years to Germany to do my research, and then I came back to write my dissertation, but I came down here in 67. So basically I was in school in the actual facility at Columbia only for a year doing my PhD and passing my orals. But I was doing my research under a director at Columbia, Eugene Rice in the history department. So.
And what was your topic?
Okay. Society and Politics of Late Medieval Ulm, ULM,
Mm-hmm.
which is a city in Germany in the southwest on the Danube. And it was essentially the period from about the 1300 to 1550. And at that time, Ulm was a very major urban power and the leader of a city league, which was constantly at war with various regional powers and noblemen and so forth. And I thought there was an interesting issue of why in other countries did the emerging quote-unquote bourgeois, it's a very different bourgeois than we know, was successful in retaining their positions and leverage and controls, and major cities became very big and long-term bases for the emergence of countries like the Netherlands. While in Germany, where you had some of the same basic initial structures, it didn't succeed. Instead, you had the consolidation of essentially princely powers, not just Prussia, but princely powers all over Germany,
Mm-hmm.
Bavaria, Württemberg, Hesse-Kassel, and so on. So that the possibility of a really democratic emergence in the 19th century was pretty much foreclosed. So.
And so before we get to Atlanta and really jump in to all of that, can you talk some about your political coming of age? You mentioned Eisenhower,
Yeah.
And why you supported that.
All right, let's see. The next real serious developments were when I actually was in Germany. I'm really bilingual. I could go to anywhere and hear and understand what was being said. So I'd go to events, and while I was in this town of Ulm, actually, might have been Stuttgart. I spent a few months in Stuttgart, then finally a few months in Ulm. Some German ministers who had traveled to Vietnam came and spoke, in a regular public session about the war going on there. And I had already spoken in opposition to the war, even though I always made clear that I'm not representing anybody, just me. Here's what I think. I think it's a disaster that we're in that war. I even used some realpolitik frameworks of saying we're fighting the wrong enemy. If our real enemy ultimately is China, why are we trying to destroy Vietnam? But what they said just put me on a different track and connected me more to what I understood about World War II. What they focused on was the use of anti-personnel weaponry by the U.S. in Vietnam. They brought some back, so you could look at them. And also they spoke about the massive use of anti-personnel bombs that the U.S. did in Vietnam, including some that, these were small, these are weapons that when the major canister opened up, it sprayed out dozens of these smaller anti-personnel killing mechanisms. Little balls, many of which were designed to attract children. Colorful, decorated, so forth. Once I heard that, even though it came from Germans who I had some, always a certain level of suspicion, I said to myself, my God, if this is what our country is doing, then we are wrong on many levels beyond the political one, on a moral level of, they hadn't yet been, as far as I know at that time, prohibited, which they were later. Mm-hmm. But still it seemed like a horrible thing to be doing. So that led to some real hard thinking in my part as to what I was doing. And then the next thing was I got a hold of Michael Harrington's book on poverty in the U.S., and I remember having arguments with other Americans when we were in Heidelberg, one in particular, an African American, and I contended there's no malnutrition in the United States. With the massive amount of food we produce and export and everything else, how could anybody starve? Total ignorance of reality. Mm-hmm. And he said, no, in my community people do starve. I said, that can't be. There's got to be something wrong, and so forth. And then I read Harrington, and it was pretty clearly pointed out, yes, in every which way. And I said, oh my God, not only do we destroy the wrong people over there, and then we use horrible weapons to do it, but we don't even feed our own people when we have the capacity to do it. So I was sort of shifting gear without even fully understanding it, but basically, when I said I was the only immigrant in the bird community, it meant that because of my own background, I had a somewhat different take on what it was the bird was doing or should be doing. Because I am not a patriot. Mm-hmm. At that time, I may still have been a little bit of one, because I did grow up here and I liked a lot of things about it, and I had a pretty nice life. But after experiencing some of these other things, and coming from an area where trusting the government is a huge mistake, I just was moving in a very different direction. So those were the other steps in terms of my mental growth at that time. And then landed in Emory, and the anti-war movement was taking off, and I realized I had to be there. And so I got engaged.
It just dawned on me, did your father continue working in banking when he came to the U.S.?
No. He wanted to make money, and he thought he could do better by going into private industry. So he started a little company. It didn't do well. He was imprinting favors for weddings and stuff like that, napkins or matchbooks and so on. And he tried several things, none of which worked out very well. And eventually what he ended up doing was working in a brokerage company, handling their foreign exchange, because he understood that pretty well at a time when not that many people did, on a small scale level. I mean, there were always people who understood it on the international, big level, but in terms of what was needed in a normal brokerage operation. So he did that and remained essentially a clerk, and retired doing that. And the only reason we did well financially, or reasonably well, is because Germany started to pay reparations in the mid-1950s. And he and my mother both obviously were entitled to it. And the German system was based on the idea that you were compensated based on what you lost, not on a system of equality of recipients. So my father, who lost more because he had a nice career and he was partners with his father in a publishing company that was doing well, sort of, deserved more than somebody else who was just a laborer or something of that sort.
Mhm.
So he got quite a bit of money, plus he had obvious damage to his health because of the stress and pressure. And my mother also had a possible career. She hadn't really worked very long, but it wasn't that she couldn't or wouldn't. So she got some of that as well as, I don't know, some other. So for some years they picked up quite a bit of money from Germany in the form of reparations. And so my father just settled into this clerical life. I'd visit him downtown. He worked on Wall Street. And so I was studying at Columbia, and I was in town, and I'd see him. I lived at home. I commuted. I did live on campus.
Did your mother continue to be involved in?
She decided she wasn't going to work,
Mhm.
period. So she didn't. No, the more interesting thing to think actually for my father was his leaving the underground. By the time World War II broke out, he was no longer involved. He had been with one of these really right-wing undergrounds called the Irgun in Palestine, which fought the British primarily and also provided some protection for Jewish communities. And I don't know in detail all the things I did or didn't do, but when the Second World War started to break out, maybe even a little before, he, in his mind, was very clear. The enemy were the Nazis. And at that point, he said, we got to stop fighting the Brits because they're fighting the Nazis, and it's stupid for us to try to do that. And of course, a lot of the Jewish underground know we have to fight the Brits because they're here and they're controlling us. So he just,
Mm.
So, he didn't do badly economically in Palestine, and then when it became Israel, because we were there for 2 years still after the state of Israel had been born. But in an import-export company, which he partially owned and then he sold. But once he got here, he was in his 40s. It's not that easy to successfully start a new business unless you really know the economy and know the things to do. So he didn't go that route.
What was the real push or major factor in deciding to leave Palestine or Israel at that point?
Well, I think there were several. Some on a purely personal level were like his health wasn't very good there. This was before they had a lot of good medications against high blood pressure. And the heat was just very hard for him to take. I'm not sure how it relates to high blood pressure, but I was told that was a big thing. The constant sense of the uncertainties of a war situation and stress between communities. He was more the follower of some of those Israeli leaders who were future Israeli leaders who were more into reconciliation in some way or other, some settlement between the Jews and the Palestinians. And he didn't like the increasingly warlike attitude that these folks had. In fact, one of the leaders whom he most respected was assassinated by another element of the Jewish community, a guy by the name of Chaim Alatzov, in 1935 or something like that. So those were factors, personal, political, and then I'd have to say, and this came out, but not too bluntly by my parents, but especially my mother, racist of an odd sort. It was the German Jewish community had always considered itself to be the elite of the Jewish international community. And they absolutely despised the Eastern European Jews, both because they felt they were better, because they were more enlightened, they had broken out of the ghetto framework, and because increasingly during the late 19th century, just as a lot of Jews came here from Eastern Europe to the United States, there were Eastern European Jews who went into Germany and were absorbed, more or less, but maintained for decades, since new ones kept coming in, some very distinctive Eastern European characteristics of dress, of eating, of residing, of family styles, and so on. And German Jews felt embarrassed by that association, as, by the way, did American Jews by new immigrants and American Jews, and created structures to help assimilate them, help them learn how to do things differently, and so forth. Well, the German Jews did some of the same, but they were constantly at stress with them. And so when they were in Israel, my parents, in those years, as that society was increasingly dominated by the Eastern European Jews, some sectors were not, like the military remained more under control of the Western Jews. They were afraid that my sister and I might marry Eastern European Jews. And they didn't want that.
Mm-hmm.
Particularly my mother. I think my father would have probably been all right with it. But my mother showed more and more sort of those tendencies. She became a Reaganite, which I was astonished at. But also worse, she would use very anti-African American language. And so, reading back, I think there was some of that impacting her. And not just, I should say, Eastern European Jews, but truly Oriental Jews, because more Arab background Jews came in as they were feeling either that they were driven out or they just felt more comfortable going away from countries where there had been long-term Jewish communities living quite well. So all of that was sort of unacceptable to her. So they left.
Yeah.
With myself at 8 and my sister at 5. Landed in schools here and didn't know a word of English. Which is why I still have a marked accent. New York.
So you mentioned reading Michael Harrington, that was a big moment for you. Were there other things that you were reading or listening to, or movies you were watching, things in the
Cultural
60s?
environment?
Yeah.
Well, obviously I was following the war situation, and I'd read newspapers. Even the Constitution locally had, and Journal, mainly the Constitution, had some interesting material about things that I was very involved with mentally, which was the war. But as I was here in Atlanta and saw, of course, aspects of the civil rights movement, which I had no comprehension of whatsoever. It hadn't been anything that I had any encounter with, or any desire to have any encounter with. The few times I passed through the South, I wanted to make sure that nobody thought of me as an outside agitator. Just wanted to, just drive, go through without any hassle. But once I was in Atlanta and was very committed to the anti-war movement and realized that there was as well a major civil rights movement that had also moved in an anti-war direction, there had to be some convergence. So I got involved in social struggles here. And this was a time when the union movement also, I had studied unions as part of my sociology and had become a strong union sympathizer. When I saw the sanitation workers in Atlanta getting active in trying to unionize and so forth, I worked with them as a volunteer, kind of pretty much a staff person, teaching at the same time, but doing that. And, just had to absorb a whole lot from a culture that I had no knowledge of. Go to their churches at times when they had events there, absolutely be bowled over by their choral singing. see them struggle for their ways to be able to maintain themselves, and realizing how huge a gap there was here in the South between the two communities. I mean, Atlanta at that time, it was black and white. There was nothing else. I mean, a couple of restaurants were black, and a lot of restaurants were white. And it was still the tallest building in Atlanta when I got here was just being built or had just been finished, which was a Regency Hyatt, you know, with the cop in the sky from that blue dome.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody even uses that expression anymore, but that's what people said then. And so, you know, the bird itself then became an avenue to begin to learn some of those things more, because different people had different knowledge and awareness, but limited, because, you know, it was an all-white structure. As far as I can think, there was one African-American who was involved fairly early, and he was related to Du Bois. His name was Burkhardt, which was one of Du Bois's family names, but I can't remember what all he did, but he was it, and he wasn't so much an integral part, he was just around occasionally. I wasn't a staff person either, so I wasn't there that much of the time. I would just write articles, sell the paper on campus, you know, give the money to the bird, go to events, help with that. But as I say, the paper was basically white, basically college educated. There were several people on it who had come through the National Student Association or whatever it was called, and were staff there, and they made that one of their projects. Gene Guerrero and Howard Romaine are the two people there. And this was before there was a women's movement yet, serious one, so it took about a year or two for a women's caucus to emerge. And there was not too much resistance to that, because most of us knew the women very well. And, you know, clearly understood they had a lot to say and bring about. There was more resistance when the first emergence of the gay movement came on the paper, around a guy called Miller Francis. Now, he wasn't involved at the beginnings of the Bird, but like within a couple of years. And he started to write articles about the cultural scene. He was mainly into music criticism. And there was some resistance to that aspect coming forth. There was less resistance to the emergence of a drug culture, which all of us to some degree got involved in, some less so than others. So that's kind of those elements that began to penetrate and change some of the orientation, let's put it this way, of the paper in terms of what it wanted to cover or not. I tended to stay more on the mainline things. I didn't get into cultural analysis much. But I did get into economic analysis. I remember one time writing an article about a struggle going on in a town I don't remember the name of, in Georgia, where the leader of the African American community was attempting to create a credit union, and the banking structure would not allow it. They did everything they could, and they managed to totally destroy it. I had been involved in helping create a credit union in my community here in Atlanta, because I lived in Little Five Points area.
The
and
bond,
we created the
yeah.
bond community. I was one of the people who helped do that. I said, wow, this is a great thing to try to do, you know? And it provides power to people who otherwise have very little access to it. But, you know, they just cut it to ribbons, you know, and there's a lot of ways to prevent something from happening if you really control a city or a town. But I wrote an article about that. And, you know, similar types of things that I got involved in. And aside from war analysis of the Vietnam War and America's empire, which is basically the way a lot of us increasingly thought of it. It's not just an isolated war, it's not just XYZ, it's the nature of our beast. So we began to develop a broader criticism of it. So, a couple of other things really impacted me as I think back. While I was still in New York, and there's been a little coverage of it recently again because it's like the 50th anniversary of it. There was a murder of a woman called Genovese. She was a young woman who was going home from work, and she was attacked by somebody with a knife, and he stabbed her over 20 times before she died, and she kept yelling for help, and there were people looking out the window. Mm-hmm. Nobody came to her assistance. And that was horrible enough. And then, I don't know if you've heard the name Altamont. There was Woodstock, and then there was Altamont.
Yeah.
And Altamont occurred in California.
Mm-hmm.
And the security that was employed was the Hells Angels,
Mm-hmm.
who were as racist a bunch of bastards as ever. And they killed the guy there,
Mm-hmm.
a black guy. And the reason they killed him, because he had a white girlfriend. And it was like it didn't happen as far as a lot of the progressive political community was concerned. So I remember I wrote a piece comparing the two and analyzing that we can't ignore the one if we are so concerned about the other. Of course, it was never run, because the Bird also exercised some censorship, because her opinions it didn't want to hear. And, what are you going to do? I was no longer that heavily involved. I was rather more doing community organizing in my own community, like with creating a community credit union and then setting up community newspapers. We had a nice community newspaper for about 5 communities for 10 years, called the Community Star, Bond Community Star.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I just, because I knew how to do these things, I kind of helped with the technical end of it. Didn't write anything, and just people wrote stuff, and they got into it and carried it on and created a viable economic basis for it through advertising, and it was distributed freely. And then later on, each of the communities developed their own little newsletter. So it became a standard way of, before the internet, before all these things existed, to create a basis for people to coordinate their efforts and to know what's going on and, get involved politically. I was certainly never heavily committed in the electoral end of it, which I didn't trust too much, although I did support some candidates at times. But it also did that, people became engaged in, standard American political activities involving organizing for elections and so on. So that was one of the things that really upset me when we couldn't deal with a thing like Altamont. Probably there were some others, but I can't recall them always. But the newspaper served a function, and it was a shame when essentially a different kind of newspaper replaced it. Creative loafing initially was a way to draw in all the business that the Bird did not want. Restaurants and sort of things like that. The Bird was a political paper. Creative loafing was sort of you can say political to some degree, but on a much softer level, and more really kind of a consumerist cultural paper
Mm-hmm.
oriented towards, you know, the growing wealth of a middle class that was emerging in larger numbers and was somewhat progressive,
Mm-hmm.
or at least wanted to think of itself that way. So we couldn't compete, or the Bird couldn't.
Right.
Now, I was never involved in that second Bird that tried to reestablish itself. I mean, I thought it was hopeless from the start, and just didn't have any clear idea of where it was going, so I didn't think it could do anything. So,
Let's go back and fill in some gaps, or just flesh out a little more. So you were working on your dissertation by 1967 and moved to Atlanta to assume a job at Emory.
mm-hmm.
On the faculty in the history department?
Yeah. I was filled two functions there. One, I taught both Western Civ and Central European history, early modern, stuff like that. But only part-time. I mean, I was a full-time faculty person, but that was only half of my job. The other half of my job was, Emory just started a history magazine for Central European history. And it had an editor who was a member of the faculty, and they needed an assistant or associate editor, whatever they called me, and that was me. So aside from teaching, I was also helping edit a major scholarly magazine, which was a good one. And I did it for about 8-9 years. Even after I stopped teaching there, I still functioned as their assistant editor on a volunteer basis, because I liked it and I read a lot of articles that way. And then eventually I realized, nope, not that interested.
Did you have experience in editing or something before that made you a good candidate?
Not in particular. I mean, I'd written papers, I'd had them critiqued, and I'd learned how to critique others, but I hadn't done any. That was before I got involved in the Great Speckled Bird, where I did learn some of that as well. But no, I mean, I just had to learn how I did it as I did it. You know.
So you started on the faculty and playing this editorial role for this publication at the same time that Tom and Stephanie moved for Tom to begin his graduate studies. And within the course of weeks, as Tom has narrated in his interview, began tabling on campus, you know, against the war. And then you mentioned the Great American Review.
Yeah.
And then how that evolves into the Great Speckled Bird. Can you talk some about the faculty perspective of what's going on among these students? Were you privy to that, or?
Well, I only really figured out what was really going on among them as we had some major conflicts. Because Emory at the time was almost totally lily white. It was beginning to try to open up to African Americans. They were admitting some students, providing a few scholarships. It was minuscule. It was tokenism at the starting point. As the African American students landed on campus, they realized, of course, to some degree what they were getting into. But it took a while for them to coalesce, and they created a Black Student Alliance, I think, within a year. And then things started happening that really upset the faculty and the administration. They started boycotts and pickets. Not to say that there hadn't been some anti-war agitation, petitioning, leafleting and so forth. But they immediately realized that this was far more serious because it could threaten their overall lifestyle of a white, nicely controlled, conservative environment. So the black students did a variety of things. One was they did a boycott of the university eating hall, Cox Hall. They had picket lines in front of it, urging people not to go in, and so that led to some confrontation.
What were their major grievances?
Well, frankly, I don't remember exactly. I would think it had to do with just the overall style of the way the place was run, who was employed in what functions, what they were being paid. I mean, you know, there probably were some documents generated, but I don't have any, so I haven't had a chance to review it. But I know that occurred, and I know that I was on one of the, or another of the picket lines and going head to head with the vice president of business or something, a guy by the name of Corey Myers. You know, we just glared at each other. He didn't know who I was, really, probably. Then one other event that occurred that was, well, there were two, but let me give you one first. The Black Student Alliance, sometime in, I think, 1969, Emory, being a Methodist-affiliated university, has a chapel. I mean, they may have a different one now, but they had this old small chapel right on the quadrangle. And on one Sunday, the Black Student Alliance went in as a group and asked the minister to step down, and then they took over the chancel and they spoke to the audience about what their sense of Emory was. I wasn't there, I didn't hear it, but this is what people told me. And how they felt really unwelcome on campus, and that it was an issue that had to be dealt with much more deeply than Emory at that point was willing to do. So, somehow or other, the whole matter came up in front of the faculty senate, which was an assembly of all the faculty, including me. And there was another incident that occurred at roughly the same time, which led to the president, whose name was Atwood at the time, calling in police who arrested some of the African-American students. And I don't remember exactly what they had been doing, but I think it had to do also with some sort of a picket line. So the whole matter, all these various interconnected events, landed in front of the faculty senate, and I got up and said, we need to censure the president. People just freaked. I mean, I was the lowest man on the totem pole, and I said, I move that we pass a vote of censure against President Atwood. And he was about 10 feet away from me. I knew this was the end of my job, of course. And there was a voice vote, and we carried it. And some of the conservatives who knew these techniques said, wait a minute, let's divide the House. That meant that you couldn't just say something and nobody would know for sure what you said. You had to be on this side or that side. And at that point, we lost it, not by much, but the shock to the system was pretty serious to begin with. The idea that the faculty senate could actually think of censuring the president, no matter what the hell he did. The other thing that occurred, and this was what really, really, I guess I would have to say, depressed me and angered me, was the speech given by the chair of the philosophy department about what the students had done, the black students had done in the, church, or whatever they call that, at Emory. He said, and I remember what he said exactly. He said, that is the end of Western civilization. was so beyond belief in my book that I said, I don't need these people around me. I have nothing to learn from them.
And are all these 3 or 4 events, are they all happening like 67 to
In 69,
70?
yeah, they were all in a very concentrated time period. The other thing, every time, and over the years you can study this and see it, that any time something rocked the boat at Emory involving race issues, there would be a big event calling together the entire community, not just the faculty. Usually in Glenn Memorial, which was the biggest place they had. I don't know if it still is. I was at one of them that was early on, like when I was still in the faculty. And there we were, and everybody was saying, Emory has overcome this problem. We have broken through our traditional racism. We are a different university. We have learned. We have progressed. Everything is settled. We da-da-da-da. And everybody stood up and applauded. I didn't, because it was bullshit. And anybody with any brains knew it was bullshit. But it's what these kinds of institutions go through to cleanse their souls and make everybody feel good. And tell them, don't worry, just go back to your little corner and you won't be disturbed. I think that was the last year I was there, so I don't remember. I didn't go to another one of them, but I've heard about them occurring, kind of things, at various other times. So, yeah.
When did you leave Emory?
I taught for 4 years, from the fall of '67 to the spring of '71. So, that's it.
So in your first semester, you became aware of the proto-bird. How involved were you with the establishment of the collective and the conception of the paper?
Well, I wasn't somebody who helped plan the structure. What I was a person who would specialize in writing certain kinds of articles. And for a while, they did have editorial categories, and I was a foreign news editor or something like that. So I would produce an article per issue, mostly about Vietnam, but not always. I went to meetings where we discussed the content, projected content, would make suggestions, offer criticisms of this or that. I also helped with the distribution because I handled the distribution at Emory. And as I said, handled giving them out initially to get people to know it, and then, selling them. And they would be donations, which whatever I collected, I passed on to the Bird, the main unit. A lot of other people, the way the Bird financed itself for a long time was by selling the Bird. To get people who needed money themselves to sell it, you had to split it. If it was 25 cents, the Bird would get 15, they'd get 10, or I don't remember what the break was. But that way, and some people sold hundreds. They did it really. It became a tourist attraction point, People who had no idea what it was, but they saw that it was something different, would buy it at least a couple of times, and you could generate revenue from that. And then you got advertising that linked to that community, and then we had the problem of what do you do with drugs and so forth. But basically that was how, the paper financed itself. At times printers were driven out, forced to drop printing, and we had to find other locations to print. And perhaps the greatest threat the Bird faced was, there was the famous motherfucker issue that we put out. And they tried to confiscate it, and then they, arrested a bunch of Bird people.
Who was they? The Atlanta police?
Police, yeah. It was either salespeople or editors for that. And they put a heavy bond on them. And they figured that the Bird would be stupid enough to give them all that money, which would have bankrupted the Bird. Instead, I organized a consortium based the law allowed you to put up bond in the form of unencumbered property within Fulton County. And by chance, one of the Bird people knew someone who had such property and was a very progressive guy. He was actually a professor at Georgia Tech who was willing to put it up. Well, okay, that's one thing, but you don't want somebody to put up maybe $30,000 or whatever it came to without any backing. So what I figured out was, well, we just have to have other people who realize this is an important issue, and you can't have a newspaper destroyed because somebody thinks something is immoral and they arrest them and they slap a heavy bond on them by breaking it down into smaller parcels. So we broke it down into $1,000 or $500 parcels. And people took different ones and said, if this happens and it's called in and somebody doesn't show up, we will split it according to those percentages and you will not be left holding the bag. He didn't even ask for it, but it just seemed like the right thing to do, and to demonstrate also that we had the strength to pull that off.
Do you remember that guy's name?
Yeah, Zeba. He was a professor at Georgia Tech. I think his name was Gregor Zeba. No, wait a minute. That's not him. It's somebody else. I don't, but I know who does, because he was the guy who knew him before. His wife was also the head of the Alliance Française. And their daughter is a writer who still writes her own little newsletter. Oh, Jesus.
We can fill it in the transcript.
Yeah, I can't remember.
Yeah.
But it's not Zeba. Zeba was a teacher at Emory. Saporta. Ike Saporta.
Oh, Maria Saporta.
Father, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, he was the guy. SS, that's why.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. He was from Salonika, Sephardic Jew.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And so he put up this money, and you came in behind.
He put up the property.
Yeah.
And then we came in behind in case ever it was called upon, because somebody, and they dropped the charges. They knew they were not. The charges were phony. I mean, it was simply a way to drain us of resources. And the minute we realized it and did this and organized it effectively, that was over. They never tried it again. People were nervous, but come on. It's bullshit.
Did you get any response from your fellow faculty members or your students? Like, clearly you're publishing in this new underground paper under your name.
Yeah, I did. But I just ignored it to a large degree.
What was the response?
Well, some actually supported what we were doing. They would be on picket lines. They would buy a copy of the Bird. They'd show there was a certain level of solidarity. There was 2 or 3. Most just totally ignored it. Others got very angry when I would point out things that turned out to be true. Like at my faculty meetings, like one time I spoke about how Department of Defense grants often cover military planning of various sorts. And they would say, no, we're just studying the migration patterns of birds. Turned out later they were studying how they could spread bacterial germs through bird migrations. They didn't appreciate some of the things that were coming out. People in my own department also were nervous about it, but they didn't talk to me directly. The only person two people talked to me directly. One, the chairman of the department, who said, you don't have that much longer to finish your dissertation. I said, I know. I mean, it wasn't really a priority for me. I did finish it because having grown up in a family where you finish what you start, I finished what I started. The main editor of the journal was a very nice guy, and he's still alive. If you knew German, I'd tell you his name because it's kind of odd in German, but I'll let that it go.
Tell me, I took a little German.
Unfug. In English, Anfang, which means nothing. But in German, Unfug means nonsense. You know, like Unrat and Blue Angel. You know, and this is almost the same thing. He said to me, you know, you spend your time writing these articles, but is that something you should do with your skills? All right. So I wasn't too surprised, you know, and at the end of 4 years, they didn't renew me, you know, because they would have had to make a decision on tenure at that point. But I knew that I really wasn't cut out for it. I did go to 1 or 2 interviews and realized, oh no. So for the next 6 years after that, I just worked in factories. You know, in Atlanta and Stone Mountain. Just totally changed my entire focus as far as work was concerned.
Did your students ever say anything to you?
I didn't. Okay, the classes I taught in Western Civ were these huge lecture halls. You know, I'd lecture a few times. The history classes, there were only like 8 or 9. They were graduate students. Yeah, we talk about it, but it wasn't anything particular. It wasn't really negative or anything else. It was just, you know, what do you think about this and blah, blah. Since I wasn't on campus much, aside from what I had to teach, it wasn't like I created a social network with them. My social network was sort of in the city with the Bird and with people involved in various activities like union organizing with the sanitation workers and things along those lines.
So were you involved with the planning and production of the first issue?
Nope.
No.
I don't think I had an article in that. Well, okay, let me rephrase that answer. I didn't do anything with the physical production of that or really any other issue in terms of layout or this and that. But I did help in raising money. I did help in discussing when there were meetings about what the Bird could contain, those sorts of things. The less concrete parts. Because at that stage, I still had a pretty heavy academic commitment. It was my first year. I had to prepare all my lectures for the first time. I hadn't given them, you know, German history or whatever. So afterwards, I could just roll on my old lectures. I didn't have to spend that much time. I had more time available. So at the time of that first year, you know, like in the spring of '68, and then of course we had this strike of the sanitation workers in the following year, and I was very much involved there.
So what do you recall of those first meetings talking about themes and what might be covered, and also can you talk a little bit more about the fundraising that you were doing, who you were targeting, how you were?
Well, I was just doing it in terms of people I knew on campus, you know, professors and even students, some of whom had money, just as a way to, you know, get their resources to help the Bird. But increasingly just focusing on how to handle sales and get more points of distribution, where I managed sometimes to sabotage it unintentionally, because I once put out an article on the Palestine-Israel issue, and the result was that there was a guy by the name of Elson, and he handled, called it Atlanta newspaper distribution or something. He handled the distribution of all the major newspapers. And at some point he said he'd be willing to distribute the Bird. But the minute we ran that article that was critical of Israel, he pulled the plug. He said, no way will I ever distribute it. And that really knocked a lot of our potential of sales out, because, you know, he had sites all over the place. So we had to figure out our own, and we tried to use stands, but mainly we relied on live salespeople.
Mm-hmm.
And that just was nothing you had to plan. People came along and said, I'd like to sell the bird. You'd give them X number of copies, and they'd come back, turn in the money, and if they succeeded, you just let them have what they needed. The effort to use another distributor just never worked. There weren't any big ones aside from him. As far as planning what issue should contain, I think there was sort of general agreement that you wanted to have a variety of kinds of subjects: local news, community news, cultural news, international news. But the international news had to be made in a form that was less and less academic. And I got criticized for my initial writings because they were pretty academic. So I learned to change my style. And that helped me as far as being able to communicate in the future on various things that I got involved in. I became a better writer as a result of that. Even my dissertation benefited from it. So, people went to these weekly discussions and went through a sense of what the last issue was like, what's coming up in the next one. They had an editorial board. They would review articles. I would sometimes review other articles in the foreign affairs sector. But I wasn't part of the standard editorial board that read everything. I mean, there were like 3 or 4 people, I think, that did that, including Tom and Gene. But Tom was the main editor. Mm-hmm. And then after about 2 years, people felt that the structure needed to be changed and that there shouldn't be a main editor. It should be more of a collective structure, and they essentially abolished that position. Mm-hmm. And some of it was a critique of Tom, but some of it was also a structural transition. And I thought that some of it was very vicious and unnecessary. It kind of was like failing to realize how much Tom's abilities and commitment had enabled the bird to get where it was. Mm. But then I was always considered a bit of an oddball there anyway, so not that anyone listened.
Why were you considered an oddball?
I don't know. My views differed because the roots came from a different place. And it's not like we said to ourselves, wait a minute, there are reasons why Ted thinks differently, because his framework is conditioned not just by what's happened here, but by what's happened to his family there. People don't realize that when most folks encountering me over the years don't automatically think of me as an immigrant, as Jewish, as anything, any different from them. Mm. In the South, a little bit more than elsewhere, because the South has been much more inbred. Until now, of course, you can't tell anything. So they just think I'm weird when I express thoughts that they find odd, or worse, traitorous. There are people who moved. The Vietnam War brought some of that out. People got. I'd go on demonstrations and up in New England sometimes got gassed. Like other people. Whatever.
Was that the Yale demonstration?
Could have been. I don't remember. It was whatever I went to.
Tom mentioned.
Yeah. And of course, I'd gone to the Pentagon attempting to levitate it. We got about 3 inches off the ground. Thought it was too much bullshit. So it collapsed. Anyway.
So you just said traitorous, that people.
Yeah, I
would
don't.
react there. And previously you said that, if I recall, you mentioned that, I don't know if I'm capturing this right, that you were sort of a step apart because you were unpatriotic or more unpatriotic
Yeah.
than other folks at the Bird.
Right. Because
How do you characterize the Bird's patriotism?
well, I think the Bird came from the assumption, which to a degree at that time I still shared, that the system here was capable of really changing in its fundamentals if it understood what it was doing. But I think as I got into my analysis of the international activities of our country, and for me it started from that end, not from the domestic end. Now my weight is somewhat different, but at that time it was, empires don't change because people think differently. They change because resistance brings about their collapse and they can't maintain themselves. So I never had quite the optimism that a lot of Americans had. And when Americans who really believed in this system looked at the Vietnam War, they got angry at soldiers who refused to continue fighting and the breakdown of the military. And it is still my view that part of the reason we got out, maybe a major part of the reason we got out, was because we were losing our army. And they didn't want that to happen. They couldn't afford for that to happen. So they had to get them out of there under some face-saving arrangement, whatever. In other words, the Vietnamese beat us because we were no longer capable of continuing that fight, except by bombing everything, every tree, every bush, whatever. And you can't win wars that way, ultimately. The shift in emphasis now is that, and I think it's coming out now more clearly than ever. And I'll tell you a little incident, by the way, in this regard, is that people understand that domestically, our racism hasn't been abolished. It's been transformed in some respects, but the basic structure of our society is still WASP run. And the WASPs have a very clear historic framework from which they are coming and which gives them this leverage. And it's not going to change overnight. And they have to be defeated. They can't be convinced because it is to their interest to maintain it. That's, as far as I'm concerned, the basic bottom line. So we have both a domestic horror of racism and we have an international horror of carrying out imperialistic, destructive, inhumane wars and manipulations and CIA pushes and things that happen in Guatemala and things that happen in Iran. And they all come back to haunt us at some point. This system can't sustain itself. I'm too old to worry too much about it because I probably won't see it. It's going to take some generations, but it's going to collapse. And there's no reason in the world why this country should continue as such. None that I can see. And things that have been put in paper, declarations of this or that, maybe they should survive. But the people who embody them in the way they operate now, no, that can't be continued as an acceptable framework for social systems. So that's what I mean by not patriotic. I am not patriotic. I don't salute the flag. I had arguments with people about during the time of the Vietnam War when I would say, I didn't like the idea of support our troops, bring them home. I just said, bring them home. That's the best support. The rest is bullshit. We don't have to. So just bring them home. Pull them out of harm's way. They're not fighting for themselves. They're fighting for the Koch brothers or whoever they're fighting for.
But you perceived even among the other Bird collective members and everything that there still was a belief in redeeming.
Yeah, which is very natural. I mean, they grew up here. They didn't have another standard of evaluation. They hadn't come from a family that had been driven out, not just because of economic reasons, but of survival. You know, they were going to be wiped out. And my grandmother was gassed. You know, and this was in a country which had a fairly high development of education. It was very literate, well trained, well organized, and it just went completely crazy. Now, I have some personal thinking about why that occurred, but I don't know that that has any relevance here. It would carry us pretty far. So, in terms of my take on the American scene, it has a very different component than from most of the people who initially were involved in the birth. Now, similar structures, of course, have much more influx of other ideas coming in, but I would say most people in this country, and a large number of people in other parts of the country, other countries, excuse me, still feel that the nation state is the ultimate form of social organization. They don't realize it, but that's what the Germans in the 19th century were saying through the voice of a guy by the name of Hegel, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And he wasn't even aware of Marxism because he preceded Marx.
Mm-hmm.
But they still carry that concept, you know, and I think now that we've seen it working its way out, it's horrendous. Even though the Nazis didn't really run a state, they did have the idea of transcending a state structure in a completely horrendous manner of racial domination. But that totally made a mockery of any state structure. So we see that it can collapse for good and for bad reasons.
Mm-hmm.
But you can't just leave it continuing what it's been doing and not try, at least, to change it or transcend it.
Somewhat relatedly, in terms of the draft, how were you implicated in that, or because you were in school, was that your deferment?
I had deferments, and then I was in the lottery 1 year before I hit the age of 26, and my number was way up there. So I really never, but I knew I'd go to Canada if it had come down to it. I mean, I'd made my mind up on that score.
Mm.
But I never had to exercise that. Yeah, I started in the years when there were deferments. I graduated college in '63, and I was in graduate school till '67, and then I taught, and so. But I supported anybody who didn't want to serve and helped them out in this and that way. There was a coffee house here that was focused on servicemen or ex-servicemen. And like some other good efforts, it was infiltrated by the police.
Is that the 12th gate?
12th gate. And they managed to gain control of it and destroyed it.
APD.
APD. They may have had some federal help, I don't know. It was a national campaign to eliminate, because there were coffee houses all over.
Mm-hmm.
That was one of the things that Bird wrote about, were the role of these coffee houses and how important they were, because we attempted to influence the attitude of enlisted men and make them aware of what kind of problems were emerged as they got into the military life and fought these wars, whatever. I mean, we were strictly against that. So we wanted to pull them away from their natural instinct to be good soldiers.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, and the 12th gate was destroyed. They infiltrated various organizations For a while, they controlled the management of WRFG. Yeah.
The radio station.
Yeah, the radio station.
Again, Atlanta Police Department?
Yeah. I helped start that too, but I wasn't involved in it then. I was a news coordinator for a couple of years at RFG. And when they had there were a series of killings that occurred. These were not the killings of children, where police killed some people. And I became convinced, I could never prove it, that there were in the police department some trained marksmen who were essentially assassins and at times killed people as requested by their military, CIA, whatever. And I thought this was probably a national program, you know, under J. Edgar. Obviously they were out to destroy the Panthers. That's one of the things I wrote about, was the killing of Fred Hampton and what that reflected, and just generally the attack on the Panther movement. That was very, very systematic. There were some here in town, and they even set up some phony Panther organizations to draw off resources. I mean, every trick in the book. Because they have fantastic resources.
Mm-hmm.
They can afford to do this. They can always hire somebody to act like something else. And we didn't have a whole lot. It's like a pea shooter against a tank.
Yeah.
Very frustrating.
So with WRFG and 12th Gate, you're pretty certain that the police department was placing people in?
Yeah. And other organizations, I mean, I'm sure they were placing them in far less radical type structures, you know, and or people who were friendly to the state framework when they moved up, and some organizations would get support to move on up and be because it was part of their own instincts. They wouldn't necessarily destroy it, but they would steer it, or try to steer it. But something like the 12th Gate, they would try to destroy. Mm-hmm. RFG, they messed it up enough that it took a while for it to recover. The Bird the Bird was never easy to penetrate that way, because people knew each other too well and had started with nothing, and they came out of nowhere, sort of. So it never really, as far as I know, had any of that problem.
What do you think was the larger public perception of the Bird? Or perceptions over the years?
Well, the Bird at its highest point may have had a circulation of 25,000, which was nothing in comparison to what's out there. So I don't think that most people took it too seriously, except the political leadership and some of the communities that were, I mean, like the Jewish community being so totally Zionist did take it seriously, because I did write those articles for years, and it was perhaps the only outlet for that point of view in this area, you know. So, but other than that, other than those kinds of groups, tourists, well, you know, they would pick it up, read it, and then they would forget it. I think there was a certain attraction to youth because it was reflected a different opening for them, and then they would, you know, be interested in getting it, and I run into people who years later would say, "Oh yeah, I know who you are. You used to write for the Great Speckled Bird." oh, I was always surprised when somebody recognized me that way, but yeah. And they wouldn't necessarily have been in Atlanta. They could have been in Mississippi, or because it did get some regional distribution.
Mm-hmm.
It would be sent out to a bookstore or a coffee shop, God knows where, near a military base or in a town. And some people came across it by chance, and then they started reading it, and they said, oh, this is interesting. And then they would keep trying to get it as long as it was around. But I think aside from that, and the disruption it caused in the local Atlanta political scene, when it managed to effectively critique some leader or some plan, and we fought on various issues over the years, and I don't recall them all because they keep coming up in one way or the other. I think the largest part of the community ignored it. You know, every once in a while a little story would hit somewhere and they'd say, oh, you know, but most of the time it was, you know, who cares? So, and the Bird itself never really figured out how to transition from being a niche paper with interesting thoughts in various areas and an economically viable entity, somewhat like Creative Loafing, but with a different political agenda. And maybe there isn't a way to do it. Maybe Creative Loafing fills a need that people want to have filled without any serious political undertones. You know, so. And there were actually other papers that tried it too for a while, and they would succeed, and then they would collapse. I can't remember the name of one of them, but there was a guy called Rick Brown, I think, who started a paper that was sort of like the Bird, but didn't get anywhere. So.
Was that contemporaneous with the Bird or more?
Yeah, it was contemporaneous, but not in the initial years. That was like after the Bird had been around about 5 or 6 years. He had actually, I think, worked on the Bird for a while and then tried to get it to shift in the direction more like a Creative Loafing, and the rest of the Bird resisted, so he just went his own way, and he was sort of a competitor. But I wasn't that involved there, so I don't really know the ins and out of that. Like I said, I got more into just working in my community on various kinds of things.
Were you involved with the Bird all the way up through the end of the original?
No, because I'd stopped. I no longer was in any way a staff person. I no longer sold the paper. I no longer, you know, I think I sort of stopped writing anything after about the first 3 or 4 years, partly because, as I said, there was some kind of censorship. That wasn't the only article, that one about Altamont, that they refused to run. There was something else I had a big fight with them about, and I can't think of what that was right now. So I had kind of backed off, and then...
Probably around the same time that you're leaving Emory, 71, 72?
Well, yeah, probably right around there, because at the same time I was getting involved in RFG. That's mine.
Okay.
Is it all right if we...
Do you want to get that?
Yeah, if I could.
Yeah, yeah.
Take a little break. I have to go to the bathroom in a bit.
There.
So I guess...
Okay.
as
So
I was-
we're back after a little break. Yeah.
As I was thinking about it, the emergence of the Bird came at a time when the Vietnam War was hitting a crisis. And that was the driving motivation for people to create something like that. But almost immediately thereafter, it came into contact with the civil rights movement, which was also very much engaged in transitioning things. And those two dynamics sort of met on the Bird after a while, not initially because the bird was purely white, but increasingly it became aware of the black issues, black dynamics, black needs in Atlanta and in the region. So it was transformed, but it never fully could make up the lack of a real counterpart in the black community that would either penetrate the bird or create its own organ. Because their structures really relied on totally different bases. Among others, the church. I mean, that's the main core of the black movement. Was then, it's not any longer, but it was at that time. And the bird never had any church support of any sort. I mean, that's the WASP establishment to a large extent. So, anyway.
To go back to this issue of censorship, so you experienced that a couple times. Did you perceive that elsewhere other than your direct personal?
Well, I did perceive it, as I said, when the gay issue emerged more. There was some resistance to having it appear. Now, I don't know for a fact whether or not one or another article was rejected on that basis, but it was a huge battle. And it took some time for people to accept that that's a legitimate kind of issue to follow and analyze and reflect. As I say, the women's issue never really quite had that, and on the racial question, the bird was always open to it. It just didn't have the source and input to be able to. So that was probably the only other area where I did sense it.
And what did that resistance look like?
Well, again, it's not that I was directly engaged, because I myself never wrote in anything involving the gay movement, but I was in discussion with people just saying, look, I mean, these folks' lives are continually being disrupted by the social attitudes of gay sex, and we need to be able to defend their right to lead their lives as they choose, period. So I know I had some big Asian conversations along those lines, but I never really was directly involved in any particular article. I just know that the person who initially brought the issue to the awareness of the bird, because he personally was involved in it, was Miller Francis, who did the cultural stuff. Not all of it, but there was another cultural sector that was underrepresented as well, and that was country western, that Gene Guerrero did coverage of. But I wasn't too interested in it, to be honest. But Miller Francis did raise the issue of the emerging cultural strands, and he met some serious resistance. And I think that probably some of his articles were rejected, but I don't know that for a fact. Or maybe it had to be totally rewritten. I don't know.
And do you know what the arguments were? Just that this isn't appropriate. The arguments against introducing this coverage.
Yeah, part of it was probably we will lose readership and we might lose some advertisers. It wasn't religiously based, as it is now, apparently. But it was based on, the economics of it. Beyond that, I really don't know. As I say, that was the only sector that I thought, and I sensed, I saw the resistance, but it was like at a meeting suddenly, you know, it would reach a point of, we don't want this article kind of thing, but no necessarily clearly stated reason.
But in that case, at least, the opponents ultimately capitulated or were overruled in consensus, because Miller did write pretty extensively.
Right.
I guess beginning maybe in 1970, I think is about when the first gay and lesbian coverage.
Yeah, so it wasn't that long into the Bird's operations. Yeah, and he did. He was a very prolific writer.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess you could say, yeah, people capitulated because they really had no leg to stand on. Still don't. But you asked if there was resistance and how it would express itself,
Mm-hmm.
and it did, and particularly to Miller. And then he was such a good writer, and he had such a broad sense of what was going on in the music sector and culture in general, that I think people bought the paper to read his writings sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Not just because the Bird was there, but because Miller Francis was one of the major Bird writers. So there was a reason to allow it to expand. So.
Sort of relatedly to cultural coverage and the Bird's interface with covering cultural issues somewhat distinctly from politics. You mentioned earlier as well influence, participation of drug culture, the Bird's relationship to that. Can you elaborate a bit there as well?
A little bit, but not much. The fact is that I would guess virtually everybody on the Bird used some, quote, illicit drugs. I did smoke marijuana for a couple of years, fairly regularly, but not a whole lot, until I got totally turned off by it, and that's pretty much all I ever did. But I think everybody did some, to some extent, and some did more. Some have done it longer, some still do it now. And I think the attitude was, rightly or wrongly, that using drugs is a form of resistance. That's not the only reason people did it. They never claimed it was. But they felt that it should be treated as something that is legitimate. I mean, the argument is simply that if you take drugs, it doesn't hurt someone else, it hurts you, but that's your choice. So the basis of it is very individualistic. And, however, we were not at that time yet conditioned by some rigid socialist Leninist framework of analysis that would say, no, individual things don't really count that much. You've got to think about the overall. Over time, some people who helped and were involved in the Bird over the years did gravitate towards these kind of Marxist-Leninist structures that sort of said to them, this is how everything is done. It became almost ridiculous, actually. And you had a real struggle on the Bird, and I wasn't involved in it, and I didn't even really particularly notice it between them. Those elements of a very rigid leftism and those elements that were pretty much still of the anarchist wing, if you want, that I always felt closer to, of, you know, how people move ahead in life, not just giving orders, but trying to evolve and convince on a humane level. But it kind of went in different directions. But that's pretty late on. That's not in the initial stages.
Mm.
And the cultural dimension always tended to the anarchists. It never can, never will, easily fit into some precast framework. Socialist realism is an internal contradiction. You know, when you think about it, it makes no damn sense. Not only is it ugly. There was no clear direction that the bird was able to give after a certain point, because the internal stresses had never been worked out enough for people to know really which way they wanted to go. And there were efforts by some of these fairly rigid groupings to exert more influence on the bird. I don't think they ever did in terms of the staff at the time. But there was sort of that tension. And the anarchist impulse that the bird did contain, I don't think was ever consciously formulated. I don't know that the bird ever wrote anything about anarchism as a political philosophy. I did write once a review of one of Marcuse's books, but he can hardly be called an anarchist. So, whatever. I mean, there was a time when a lot of things were coming flying in, and then you'd suddenly realize, woo, like there was a book called Fan Shen, which had to do with the Chinese Cultural Revolution and so on. And it was a very interesting book. And then you realized that, and this really bothered me as an historian, that it literally edited pictures and eliminated figures because they disagreed with their politics. And this has recurred, this keeps happening. You know, I mean, it's like incredible. But some people would argue, well, that helps you strengthen your forces against the divisive elements of reality. So,
back to the cultural bent of the bird and constituencies or publics. Is there anything to say about the bird's relationship with Atlanta's larger hip scene?
Well, it was an accepted part of it. I mean, it would advertise events and people would come see them. It was a good outlet for music promoters of their events, clubs, and so forth. But remember, that sector was still pretty small here. It was beginning to grow and grow fast in a certain way, but you know, once that sector had really become so strong, the bird had ceased to exist. You know, I mean, the bird went out of business in 77, 78, somewhere in there. The second bird I don't really consider a significant factor in any way. And that's when you really had the stronger cultural emergence of, you know, various bands and groups and activities and theaters and so forth. So the bird helped prepare the ground well, wasn't around much to benefit from its emergence.
Mm.
That's, anyway, my view of it.
Mm.
So.
Can you talk a bit about the physical environment of the various bird offices?
Well, I knew the one on 14th Street very well because that's the first one. And that's what, at a time when we all knew that the realtors were renting it to us cheaply, the house, because part of it was to drive other options out so it could eventually be totally razed and rebuilt as it is now. And that they've always done the steering of people here or there to transform the physical environment of a given area. So, but that was a very pleasant environment. It was kind of like a big house, and people sort of felt that way about it. You know, you come in and out. Some people lived there because they couldn't afford to live anywhere else, and the pay was miserable if there was any. And it's the only one that I really knew that well because it was there. We were there for at least 2 years or so. I don't remember.
And was it a big, like, two-story
Yeah, it was
sort
a
of
big-
turn of the century?
Yep, pretty much. Very nice facility, or you know, plenty of room to do what we needed to, and for people to live there and get together and have parties, meals. Then there was one up on just off of Piedmont near Ansley Mall. There was one on North Avenue. Those three I recall specifically. There probably was another one or two, but I don't remember them. So the one I was in and out of a lot was the house.
Mm-hmm.
And to some extent, the one on Piedmont, which then was bombed or firebombed or something, was destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
But not the other ones particularly. I just no longer had that much of a linkage there. As I said, I was really engaged in community work in my area with credit union, newspaper, whatever else.
What about the personal relationships and work relationships among?
Well, there weren't work relationships. I wasn't involved with anyone else in terms of work. I mean, when I worked in factories, I worked in factories. I was the only one there. I didn't know anybody else there who had any bird affiliation. I did help people who were part of the Brodek community sometimes get jobs there or other facilities. Because I went through a bunch of different ones for the 6 years I did that stuff. But then when I started, well, after I stopped teaching, I went into factories. That lasted 6 years, involved different facilities. The last one that I was in, pretty much the last one I was in, was 4 years in one place out in Stone Mountain. But it didn't connect me with anybody else in particular, just the folks there. And that was really good. I really felt good about that whole experience.
What about the relationships, though, internally among the bird people? Can you speak to that?
Okay. Of the group that did found the bird, sort of, you know, we did have fairly close relationships. But in a way, I was kind of the oddball because, you know, they didn't have much in the way of income or steady jobs. They just committed to the bird and they did all they had to do there. I did have, for 4 years, a steady job, good money. I mean, not rich, but, you know. Then I got married during that time. So I had other priorities that I was working on in my own life, aside from the bird, which was psychologically very important to me. So we'd have potlucks, events, get-togethers, this sort of thing. And I probably was closest to Tom and Stephanie because they were the people I met when I first got involved, and they were the people that, carry the load on the bird. There were other people that also felt very close to them. And, we maintained a relationship. For a long time when I was just alone and hadn't related to anybody else, I would often pop up at their house, kind of thing. Then as I got married, that was less the case, but still. But it wasn't such a formal thing where, you'd invite someone to have dinner. That would occur sometimes. Most of the time it was kind of like it flowed from one to the other. From working on the bird to just enjoying a meal together.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes at the same time, sometimes at slightly different times. And you got to know all the other key people who were around the bird, like Howard and Gene and Steve Wise later. So you'd encounter them when you went to the birdhouse or to wherever they happened to be. Bob Goodman. But I can't say that it, for me anyway, created a ongoing set of relationships, except with Tom and Stephanie pretty much. And then that sort of, ended too after a while, partly because there was a real political break between us. Because I tended to stay on the anarchist wing of things. And they got into the Marxist-Leninist wing of things, which I basically didn't respect. Yeah, so, but that's way down the road. That's probably in the 1980s that emerged.
Was there is there a particular issue or theme column that's most memorable to you?
You mean in terms of print? You said column.
Yeah.
Oh, well, there were some cute ones, like this one professor at Tech wrote a column called Og King of Bashan. I got to know him pretty well, Buttfoot, and his daughter, who eventually became manager of the Bond Credit Union for a while. And he was a neat guy. And that was an interesting column for people who liked imaginary arrangements and possibilities. Not always my cup of tea, but still. And other than that, it was pretty scattergun. Wolf and Stinkenauer put in ads where he paid for them of crazy stuff, but some people I'm sure like that too. What was astonishing was that he paid for them as an ad. Just whatever. But other than that, no.
And what was your personal life during these years and your living arrangements?
All right, well, as I said, I came here in Atlanta and started to engage in the political scene when I was a single individual. I met my future wife when we went to try to levitate the Pentagon in October '67.
Okay.
So that was only a few months after I'd come here. And so I spent a lot of time with her, and we married the following June.
So she was living in Atlanta?
Yeah, she was a graduate student at Emory.
Okay.
In the American Studies program.
Mm-hmm.
So we married in June of '68. So from then on, I was a twosome.
Mm-hmm.
We were kicked out of the place I had been renting because the landlady said I cannot condone people spending the time together when they're not married. I said, yes, but we just got married. Too bad. So we rented another place for a year, which was just an apartment, close to Emory, right across the street actually. And then somebody who was on the Emory faculty sent around and noticed that they were leaving where they were, and it was available, and so we looked at it and decided to rent it. It was a house, and it was cheap. It was $125 a month, right in the Lake Claire area,
Mm-hmm.
not far from Little Five Points. And actually, we stayed there forever until we divorced. She threw me out, and she stayed in the house, and I bought another house in East Atlanta. That was only about 3.5 years ago, something like that.
And you rented the house in Lake Claire all that time?
No, we bought it.
Oh, okay.
Because everything was for sale cheaply in those days.
Mm-hmm.
And we paid it off within 3-4 years. We had no mortgage after that. When we had a mortgage, it was only $115 a month. So, you know, I mean, and it was a good house. Brick, solid.
Yeah.
We made changes to it, expanded it. Had our kids there. I mean, they grew up and lived in one house until they finished high school.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had a very stable base of living. And in that community, I got very involved in the neighborhood association. I became its president for a while, and the NPU president for a while. You know, just engaged in the usual kinds of things you do there, you know. Some lobbying, some helping with a newspaper, handling zoning issues, you know, the broad range of things, and fighting off realtors. Not an easy fight, I'll tell you. They see so much money at the end of the line that they will put in massive energies for a long period. And the trouble is, Lake Claire is now totally transformed from what it was. Lake Claire, Candler Park, the whole area.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of where I am now is more like Lake Claire was then, or as I describe it, slightly disreputable.
Yeah.
So that kind of was the environment in which I lived. For a time, we tried to live collectively with another couple, but they broke up and then it didn't work. That only lasted about a year.
And when was that?
Oh, that was probably in '73, somewhere in there. They were not involved with the burden anyway, or even politically with anything. The woman sort of got oriented towards the women's movement somewhat. But we just otherwise lived as a couple, and then in 1975 we had our first child. Who's the person that phoned when we were talking?
Mm-hmm.
She was calling. She's being interviewed for a job in Boston. She's been a planner and architect in the Parks Department of San Francisco. And so she's kind of been there long enough, I think she feels, and wants to maybe move. So they started interviewing her, and there are only 4 candidates left. But, you know, there are certain areas where she knows she doesn't have quite the cards, but still, it's a good experience.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And she had to ask herself, do I want to move to the East Coast?
Yeah.
After being on the
Uh-huh.
West Coast for 15 years. Yeah.
Yeah.
But anyway, so she was our first child, and we had another one in '78. And so we were involved, of course, in school activities, and I became since my jobs were so flexible in many respects afterwards, not always, but sometimes, I was the main driver when they went to play soccer,
Mm-hmm.
their games and stuff like that. That was fun. And, but, you know, it takes time, but it's something I enjoyed doing.
Was your wife at the time also involved in the bird?
not involved, but she did write a couple of articles for it.
Mm-hmm.
Good articles, because she had a really good way of handling some things, like involving health centers and stuff like that. But mainly, she became a teacher and sort of slid into it. I mean, she'd been in the Peace Corps, and she had taught in India English to kids. And then here, she was at Emory, she got her master's, and was looking for work, and I don't remember exactly the sequence, but she landed teaching English as a second language at Georgia Tech. We often had part-time, 2 classes or something like that, but it was decently paid. And it gave her flexibility when the kids were young, because sometimes I was working full-time and I didn't have as much flexibility. It was like a seesaw affair. And then after that, she just went into high school teaching, taught American history, world history, mainly up in Cobb County in Smyrna. But she did that until she retired. So she took a couple of years off and got a PhD at Emory too. For 2 years, she worked on a very good little study of unionism among teachers, the role of the GAE, Georgia Association of Educators.
Right.
So, so my life was conditioned from 74, 75 on with the family.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that was the framework in which we lived. And it was nice. We took trips to Europe, camped mainly with the kids, which was great fun.
Mm-hmm.
And every third summer we'd go out to the West Coast where Ann, my wife, was from, because her family had a cabin right on the ocean there, a nice primitive type cabin, very nice little cabin. And it would be our turn because there were 3 sisters, and they each had one summer, and we use that to get out there. And sometimes Ann, because she had long summers, would drive the kids out, and I would fly out and meet them because I had to still stay on a job, whatever. And so our life was I guess you would say, typical sort of lower middle class family life.
So you probably, was there anything that precipitated your move away from writing for the Bird and being more involved, or?
Well, as I said, there were sometimes issues of censorship, but that alone would have only prevented me from being as involved. And I could always, when I wrote an article about something that I really felt strongly about, usually it would get printed. Like when a friend of mine, a close friend of mine, a Palestinian, moved back to Egypt, I wrote a letter to him, public letter to him, about how important he had been in my life in terms of helping me understand the Palestinian dynamic better than I had. And that was printed, maybe there were some others, that's the one that comes to mind. So, but I think it was more that I just lost a sense of what the Bird's function was, because it didn't really switch as things changed, and what it was doing still was seemingly less and less relevant. It hadn't sort of found a new main line of, development that would relate to people's problems. So I got more into community organizing because I felt that in a way everybody had to organize their communities to come up with different answers. Credit unions to me was one that I strongly believed in, although I no longer believe quite as strongly in it, because ultimately it tends to have the same tendencies as any other capital controlling entity does. and stops trying to transform this system and becomes a participant in it, you know. So, I mean, I was on the board of that, and I could see it occurring, and I liked the people, even if they were bankers and, you know, businessmen and all this sort of thing,
Mm-hmm.
which I was not.
Mm-hmm.
I've never been a businessman. I mean, except for myself as a business, which is what I do now. But I don't control anyone else's activities. So, you know, what else can I say, really? You know, just after being a factory worker, I became a translator for a German engineering company, part of Krupp, actually.
Mm-hmm. What type of factories
Did I work
were
in?
you working in? Because that was from 72 or 73?
73 to about 77.
Okay.
Or 78, roughly in there. Because 78, I went to work for this German engineering company. They were mainly metal-oriented type factories. The one I worked at 4 years was one of the very few union contracted plants in Atlanta, in Georgia, in Atlanta, right out in Stone Mountain. That what we did was we made kitchen equipment for places like Red Lobsters and other chains, and sometimes individual locations where they needed, you know, you get in a bare metal and you shape it, bend it, weld it, polish it, wire it, you know, if you're running electronic or electrical parts in it for serving counters or whatever. And it was a small plant, so it was nice. It was like 40 people, basically set up in a warehouse with equipment. And it was tough work, but it was diverse. It was like an old carpentry shop, except in metal.
Mm-hmm.
So you learn a lot, you know.
Mm-hmm.
You learn how to read blueprints, you learn about wiring a bit, you learn about this and that and the other. Some things you don't learn very well because it really takes long practice, like really knowing how to weld metal to metal, smooth, thin metal. I could never do that. I could weld burning a rod, but I couldn't really do fine welding.
Mm.
So I did that and did some maintenance in another factory. Did painting in a third factory. I got either laid off or fired at least 3-4 times. And, you know, because for various reasons. Not knowing enough how to function in a factory initially. The jobs I got first in factories didn't last very long. It took at least to the third or the fourth one before I kind of knew my way around.
Mm.
It's like a second education.
Yeah, I would think, and I was going to ask how you broke into this sort of work as, you know, being in your latter 20s at this point.
Right. It wasn't a problem.
Where you had been trained as an academic to do.
Right. It wasn't a problem because there were lots of jobs. And when I switched jobs, I became known eventually as a jackass of all jobs. You know, and that's what it was. And I had some skills that I could, you know, like the translation thing. That came about because when I came, we'd been on vacation in Oregon. I was between jobs and I guess I hadn't yet started a full-time teaching. I came back to town and I bought the Constipation, and those days they had an ad for a full-time German technical translator. And I said, you gotta be kidding. It's like it was written for me. Because how many other people around here would be able to do that? Because now I knew enough about technical stuff and I knew German.
Mm-hmm.
And I got the job. Driving was a hell of a pain because I had to go all the way up to Cobb County, but I was going against the traffic flow. But I kept that job for 4.5 years, became a pretty good translator. And then they laid me off, but they still used me because they needed me at times. And I had more free time so I could get another job, and I did. I started to become a union organizer after mediating. My main line after that was mediation. But I did take a job as a union organizer for about 8 years for the union in the film sector. technicians. First with an independent union, and then with the IA, which is a big IATSE, the theatrical stage employees. And they have also film, which they were set up to do to drive communists out in the West Coast, because communists were very strong in the craft end of filmmaking.
And you were
then I
doing
quit.
that from Atlanta.
Yeah, I did that in Atlanta because I had a little group here in Atlanta. It's before film was big here, but they had a group of people. They mainly did commercials at that time, but occasionally a film. So I would help negotiate what little there was to negotiate. Most of the time they were unorganized, but I could help get them something and deal with other things they needed, like insurance, medical insurance. And then, eventually the industry grew, and the main union, the IATSE, absorbed our little group here, and I didn't like IATSE at all. And so I quit, and then I just remained independent as a mediator, translator. Did that. On my 50th birthday, as I say, I fired my last boss. So, and it worked out. I mean, between those two things. Now I do very little mediation anymore, translation anymore, but I still do regular mediations for various institutions. And I don't do it, I've avoided actually doing it in the totally private sector where I just work for law firms or individuals. I do it only for institutional structures, government bodies like, Fulton County, DeKalb County, the post office, stuff like that.
And how did you get into that? Did you have to get credentialed in some way? Yeah.
It was pure chance. A friend I knew who was actually a Quaker, I was walking in Little Five Points one day between jobs, which was not unusual, and he came up to me and he said, "Hey, I've just been hired by this group that's setting up a facility called the Neighborhood Justice Center. It's part of the project by Attorney General Bell to reach out into communities and see if there'd be a way to help resolve issues before they go to court, kind of thing. Would you like to learn how to become a mediator?" And I said, "All right." And it was a 3-day training, that was all. And after that, basically what you did was did volunteer mediation. You went and they set up cases and you dealt with them as best you could. And you got paid $5. But it was really interesting, and I really enjoyed it. And I found that I had a certain kind of skill for it, because what it takes, among other things, is the ability to think outside the box in terms of what could resolve a given situation. And then over time, it got expanded into other sectors, like the one I mainly focus on now is divorce custody, marital issues. And, it just has been a good area for me, as well as, I think, actually helpful to people. Because keeping him away from a judge is, as far as I'm concerned, a good thing. I've never wanted to be in front of one myself. I did get sent to jail a couple of times, so I don't need that too often. So.
Do you want to elaborate on that?
Well, it was when I was working with the unions about sanitation workers. They arrested a whole bunch of us for blocking entrance to sanitation facilities. Another time I was picketing for something else. I got arrested. Got arrested once around the state capitol for distributing the bird. Bullshit. What can I say? But, bologna sandwiches only go so far, and I don't need to eat them every day.
No.
So I stayed away. And then, of course, at Emory, when I was still at Emory and getting arrested, they'd always put up the articles. Emory professor, they loved that.
I'm sure. So how did, if at all, what impact did the bird have on your life after the bird?
Well, the bird was obviously a very necessary framework for me to be able to function politically at that time. I had a strong drive to engage, and there was nothing I could engage in that I could do as well as what I did at the bird. Because it had the flexibility that I didn't have to be there every day. In other words, getting a job, doing it. But I could sort of engage in writing, engage in distribution, engage in getting involved in issues. And every time I did that, I learned more. So it also helped me meet people because there was no natural way for professors to meet each other except through professional associations or fellow faculty, both of which I found extremely boring. I mean, some of them were nice people, but I just wasn't geared in that direction. Not that I'm particularly interesting, but at least my interests are different. So most of the MA faculty that I did encounter at times were very conservative, politically and personally. So the bird was a real different framework of interactions with people, issues, activities. It gave me a sense of how many different options there are out there. Because until then I thought, well, you become a teacher and that's it, whether it's high school or college or whatever. Then I said, wait a minute, there's many different things to do. So I chose to go into factory work because it was a totally new sector, and it was interesting. I learned a whole lot of different things, both technically and personally, about people. Not always pleasant, but like at that plant in Decatur or Stone Mountain where I worked for 4 years, I ran into some real stone-cold racists among the whites. But there were blacks there too, and they were some of the most open, generous people. And not all the whites were racist. There were some really decent folks. And not all the blacks were nice. But at any rate, I got to know people from a very different walk of life than I'd been involved in before. And I was certainly the only Jew they'd ever encountered. And some of them had some real prejudices about us, And it was interesting to hear that, So having been involved in the bird did give me greater flexibility in being able to interact with people. And that was really the thing I lacked most.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying I'm very good at it now, but what I have learned by being involved with folks who didn't reflect the background I came from. Sometimes they have a hard time understanding where I'm coming from because I am an immigrant, even though they don't always realize it until I actually make a point of it and say to them, being loyal to one country to me just makes no sense because it led to disaster for lots of folks. And I'm not going that route.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I don't want my children to go that route. In fact, both my daughters have 2 passports. And I urge everyone to have at least 2.
Mm-hmm.
Having one is a joke. Because they can always pull it on you and then you're stuck. Oh, you have 2.
No, I need to
work on it.
Yeah, I need to find the angle there.
Yeah, they just gave it to me because they said, well, your family was driven out. Of course you have a right to one here.
Right.
And then said, and by the way, if you want your daughters to have it, they can have it too. So that was that. It was easy. But a lot of people find some European ancestry connection, or I guess it'll now be African ancestry connection, where they can come up with a passport.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think everybody should do it.
Mm-hmm. We never discuss this, but how did your family, particularly your sister, your parents, respond or engage with your political activities and your work with the bird?
They were not too happy with it. Not so much the politics, because, as I said, my father had been very much involved, and he certainly didn't like the Vietnam War. But he wasn't going to get involved in the American political system because he felt that as an older immigrant, he was pretty much at risk. I mean, shortly after they got here, there were the Rosenberg trials, and being Jewish, that really shook him up. I didn't understand what was going on. I was 8 years old, what the hell am I supposed to understand? But for them, it was a major psychological encounter. And so my getting engaged in the politics of the anti-war movement was something they could understand, but nothing they really felt strongly about that I should do. And as it became clear to them that I was doing these things and leaving the academic world, which is where my mother in particular thought it was great that I was staying in, she was upset, and so on. And then I went into factories, and they just couldn't grasp that whatsoever. My father sort of, because he'd had to do different things in his life, but my mother, she just... When I got back into translation and was in this German company, they sort of leveled off a bit. And then mediation sort of made sense to them. I, for a while, went to law school here at Georgia State, actually got a scholarship. But after 6 weeks, I had it. I said, I'm not doing this. But they were happy about that for a few weeks. Actually, my father was already dead, I think, at the time, so it was only my mother. But, no, they, especially my mother, didn't care for the direction I was going. So, but, it's my life.
Mm-hmm. And other than voicing a disapproval, there wasn't further strain?
No, I mean, we saw each other still regularly. She'd come down or I'd go up there. She and my wife didn't get along. She was convinced that my wife was anti-Semitic, which isn't true, or wasn't true.
Mm.
But, she sensed it in some way. And I think that it wasn't so much that she was anti-Semitic as that she never really related well to foreigners. I think when we got together, she didn't realize quite the depth of what it meant for me to be an immigrant. So as these attitudes came out in me, they shook her up a bit. At least I feel that's one of the things that conditioned the breakdown in our relationship.
Mm.
But we were married 40 years plus. So now that I've done mediation in that sector, that's rare.
Yes.
But it was hard for me and to break down, and I now have another partner. We're not married. I'm not getting married a second time.
Mm.
But I couldn't ultimately live alone and feel any satisfaction in life that way.
Mm.
But I'm also not very involved politically anymore. I'm just sort of reading, reacting, talking to people occasionally, but not engaging in any organizing work.
What are you most passionate about these days? Or what are the ideas that matter the most?
What I'm most passionate about is my children. I mean, they occupy my thoughts. Luckily, one is in Atlanta. She's actually a pretty good organizer in terms of the kinds of things she's organizing, which has to do with herbal medicine and creating a Georgia herbal society and handling people, producing product, counseling, all kinds of things. Weaving together, going out and speaking and she's just all over the place
Mm.
and very, very good at it. As I said, I think this empire is heading towards collapse. And the only thing that I think one can do in that situation is try to make people aware of how transitory all of this is. That there's no way they can sustain this over the long haul. And if they do, and as they do, all they do is they exploit others more. Because that's the law of capitalism. You've got to build up capital. And if you can't earn it honestly, you have to earn it or steal it. It's just all there is to it. So people have to be aware that that's the future. And if you look at the way in which our social system functions, whether you want to say it was because of Clinton or whatever, it has increasingly cut the guts out of any kind of viable social welfare system, even though this is the richest country in the world. And it could obviously do all of that stuff. Simple solution: abolish the Pentagon. You know, if we'd succeeded in levitating it, it would be beyond the moon by now. But it's much simpler if you want to just cut the budget, let them go. Find another country to take over. Get them out of here. Every fucking one of them.
That would open up some funding.
Yes, it certainly would. And it would take people's, and you know, the South is the most military and militarized part of the country. There's a book I'd recommend to you. Have you ever heard of Cash? I think his initials are J.D. Cash or something like that. The Mind of the South.
Oh yeah, a classic. Yeah, I've read that a couple times.
You read it a couple of times.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's fantastic.
It holds up. Published in 42, I think. Yeah.
He died of drunk 6 months after he finished the book.
I think he killed himself.
Well, yeah, drinking. You know. It's a fantastic book. I just stumbled on it and started reading it and said, wow, makes so much sense. And it's really, of course, he means the white South.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the problems people have when they say the South, almost universally they mean the white South. Well, there have always been two Souths. Possibly even more, but certainly two. And that should be said always when one says the South. But he just only dealt with the white South.
Mm-hmm.
And its reflection of the black community, but not the nature of the black community. He didn't pretend to know. But it's a great book. How did you come upon it?
I took a class in Southern history, and that was the foundational text. We read that first.
No kidding. Because
Yeah.
I thought it had been ignored by historians.
At least the professor I was studying with.
You're at Georgia State.
Yeah, Glenn Askew.
That's good.
Yeah, set up the whole course where you read J.W. Cash, Mind of the South, first week, and then everything else throughout the semester,
Built on it.
yeah, was responding to, and then the final assignment for the class was a historiographical essay taking Cash and then responding to this debate in Southern history of which is more which trend prevails and drives the South more, continuity or change. Cash would be with the continuity.
But remember, he's only talking about the white South.
And only up to 1942, which, you know,
Yeah.
With the federal government taking a bigger interest in colonizing, possibly, the South during the Second World War, has had a huge...
Right, except that if you read The Mind of the South, of the white South, that is still the mind of the South ruling elite. The federal government doesn't really count. I mean, they figured out ways to get around anything that we may want to do. Of course, the dynamic between black and white has changed, but they know they still run the show. They still control the capital. It is still a WASP-run country. You know, so. But it's a great book. I mean, I couldn't believe it. I couldn't put it down.
I'm going to have to go back. It's been 10 or 15 years since
That's been that with me too. I probably
since I
should as
looked
well.
at it.
I introduced it to a friend of mine who was a Southerner, born and bred, and he just got blown away. Because he's a progressive guy. He used to do Neighbors Network, and they would infiltrate the Klan.
Mm-hmm.
And that's an interesting thing to get oral history on. He's trying to do it. There's a collection at Emory, I think, of things involving that. They're trying to piece together. But anyway, yep, the South. That's where I am. Never get out.
Yeah. Over 40 years now.
And you don't sound like you came from here, though, either.
No, I'm originally from Pennsylvania,
Okay. That makes some sense of it.
but moved here when I was 12.
12, oh, okay. Well,
But the accent has never
totally left, yeah.
picked that up. And if you get me around people from southeastern Pennsylvania for more than a couple hours, it becomes more pronounced.
Why did your parents come here?
Work. My dad's business, or the industry that he worked in, environmental remediation. They wanted to open a branch office here, so he got sent.
He didn't volunteer.
No, not really. Like the company he worked for this was in the 80s, and they were trying to expand in a lot of different directions, and they said, "You want to open an office in Chicago? No. You want to open an office in San Diego? No. Do you want to open an office here? No." And finally they came and said, "Do you want to open an office in Atlanta?"
Or get
You
fired.
can't." Yeah. He was like, "All right."
And he never regretted it.
They're still here? No, he loves it. And he thinks the South is a amazing place. Which
It in its ways is, but
Yeah.
it's still horrible. I mean, it's like, God,
he doesn't even drink sweet tea.
no kidding.
Still drinks it unsweet.
How can you do that? Beyond me. Yeah, well,
So have you to bring it back to the bird, and we can wrap up and then continue. We don't need my family history on record yet. Have you maintained many relationships with folks from the bird over the years?
no. I mean, I run into them occasionally at like Cliff's funeral
Mm-hmm.
or memorial service, whatever that was, and occasionally parties. But I don't seek them out. They don't seek me out particularly. Bob mentioned this, if I was willing to do this. I said, sure. Historical records, why not? But on the whole, no.
You don't go to the reunions?
I would say no. I think I've been to one. Yeah, just doesn't feel right, because I separated myself consciously from it after its first couple of years, 2-3 years,
Mm-hmm.
and then just did an occasional article,
Mm-hmm.
but no longer really felt involved. So I haven't had a strong interest in those kinds of things. But then I don't go to any reunions. I don't go to class reunions. I don't go to any of those things. It's just,
Mm-hmm.
I'm truly an anarchist in a lot of ways. But that's a joke, actually. But I just don't engage in group activity much.
Yeah,
So.
I get that. Was there anything further that you'd like to cover? Anything from childhood, the bird years, post-bird? Words of legacy?
No, not really. I mean, I feel that for years I just lived a pretty normal life, engaging in my community and engaging with my family, and now I'm sort of just taking it pretty easy.
Mm-hmm.
I work about 4 days a month as a mediator, and the rest of the time I just sit around and laze around and spend time with my partner. And she's very different than my first partner. Irish descent, out of Boston.
Mm.
That's a very unique breed too.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's kind of interesting. And yeah, just no, I really sort of covered it, I think.
Well, I certainly thank you for it. This is still the very beginning of the project. You're only our second interview.
So Tom was the
Tom.
first?
Tom was the first. And I'm sure that every interview that we collect is going to further flesh things out and give nuance and
Mhm.
depth. But having conducted the interview with Tom, this was fantastic to have compliment and counterpoint. So
Good.
I thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, well, you conducted a good interview, gave me enough freedom to talk as much bullshit as I want.
Job done.
Yeah.
Right.